Okay, so we want to think about, in this early American tradition, when you look back at records of old Puritan sermons and look at some of the old newspapers, once those were more of a thing, and any of the cultural narratives and so forth, there's all these colorful names for the devil, and a very clear implication that the devil is, and hear this, the devil is out there, like in the woods, like personified, running around, looking for people to just murk, as the youth might say these days, or gank. Okay? So, that takes us through our section. Jump over into early America. We have the same narrative picked right up a couple of decades later. So we're now basically not paying any more attention to Europe at this point. And the big story in terms of forest and outdoor recreation management and how we got to where we are today from the late 1600s and early 1700s, so very much what American school and history teachers would refer to as the colonial period. We're going to have three big movements, and these are tectonic, metaphorically, level shifts of what it's like to be in America. First revolution, the scientific revolution. Scientists begin to slowly and deliberately pry from the control of the Catholic, and later the Anglican and other Protestant churches, the narrative on how reality works. And they do this through experimentation and science communication in its early form. Okay? So this is the time period in which we're starting to get development of what we now sort of take for granted as the scientific method. You have an idea about how something works, how the world works, how an engine might work, how a body might work, how an ecosystem might work. And then you set up an experiment and you try to run that experiment with maybe a couple of parallel trials or a couple of different parallel treatments, maybe a control where one section of it is not getting any of those treatments, and you see the effects of these parallel trials or parallel treatment levels or what have you. And you come back to your research question, your hypothesis, and you say, okay, well, this experiment shows that this is part of how light works, or this is part of how gravity works, or this is part of how human physiology works, or this is how we can do surgery and it doesn't have a 100% fatality rate. It's 3% better fatality rate, so lower fatality rate, if we use this sterilizing solution on our tools. We should use it on the body as well. Oh, no, that sterilizing solution, turns out we can't inject bleach into people to cure COVID, right? Let's run a new experiment with something else. Moving on. So, the scientific revolution is a big deal, right? For thousands of years, the church, the temple, the synagogue, the mosque have been telling everybody directly, this is how the world works because this is what the Bible, the Quran, the Pentateuch, the Septuagint, the whatever the religious text is, this is how it works. And we know this is true because God is real and God is right? And then the scientists are like, actually, not saying that that's wrong, because we all remember how Galileo ended up executed for scientific rigor and merit. But when you do this experiment, and you can do this experiment too, this is the result that you get. And so therefore reality must work. In this little corner of reality, it must work like this, because we can test that, right? That's a tectonic shift. That's a seismic change in how we understand the world to be. And what that does is this starts to subtly at first, slowly at first, quietly at first, but with increasing momentum, increasing volume, increasing power, start to contravene narratives like the Legend of Sleepy Hollow. Because I'm a forestry scientist, and I think it'd be really interesting if I could run an experiment on Old Scratch, literally the devil running around in the woods, but I've never seen him there, so I can't run that experiment. And so maybe I'm not going to put a lot of effort into chasing down that particular thing, and instead I'm going to start to look at the forest as a collection of trees, and eventually, after a while, peoples associated with these places and ecosystems and the cultures that they represent, and so on and so forth, right? So seeing the world in less of a superstitious or religiously governed way is a huge change. This is kind of the first time that anybody has ever been a part of a society where that's even possible. Up to this point, for however many thousands of years since the beginning of human civilization and communication among peoples, we have any narrative other than faith-based ones. Now, I am a person of faith. I don't see these things as in conflict with each other. I'm not worried about that. I don't lose any sleep over it. But this is a huge shift. No matter what perspective you adopt, no matter what your personal worldview is, this is a big deal. All right. Politically, we have another revolution happening kind of in parallel with the scientific revolution. There are a lot of French chemists and physicists and so forth active in this time, and they're sort of having to work around the inconvenience of a lot of the early scientists were independently wealthy nobles, like Isaac Newton, for example. A lot of these guys were self-funded. Until we get a science and research apparatus really of the 20th century where public support is available for them. So politically speaking, the French Revolution is pretty contemporaneous, or around the same time, since that word, for at the same time as the American Revolution, right? So the American Revolution in what years? Anybody know? 76. There you go. Through early 1780s, and then immediately after, so we only won the American Revolution because specifically of French land logistics support, military support, and then especially the French Navy. Like, they really kind of low-key won the war for us by cutting off the British from their own resupply and forces. And then the French Revolution happens, and the French, the hoi polloi, the rest of us, the sans-culottes, all the folks who are not royalty, like, call up their homies in America, and they're like, hey, remember when we backed you up on this revolution? And we're like, new parchment, who dis? And we're like, sorry, we're too busy getting our stuff together. So the French Revolution was, it was 10 years. Like, that's a long time to go, here I go killing again. And basically the entire royalty, the entire nobility class of France just gets guillotined and imprisoned and executed one after the other. And it's a whole bunch of really exciting stories and stuff like that, super bloody. But what this did was, this signaled to Europe that these American colonists of no great repute, who just happened to win a war against the major imperial power, England at the time, because they were separated by an entire ocean and blocked by the French and so forth. Then a similar kind of revolution happened in Europe, and all of a sudden, all of the European countries, based on monarchies and so forth, were like, oh shoot, we got to not be super duper oppressing our people, because what if all of these people come for us next? And that took a lot of pressure off of the very, very young United States, so that the United States, so that the young American country could sort of get set up and join everybody else on the world stage, while everybody was distracted with potential revolutions on the continent. The third big movement happening right around this time is the founding of the Industrial Revolution, the factory system, the ability to manufacture stuff with interchangeable parts. So recall, up to this point, industry is pretty much all handmade stuff, and everything is bespoke, or these days we might say artisanal, or I don't know, curated, in the sense of, if somebody was making a musket, for example, if you were a gunsmith instead of a blacksmith or a cooper or a cobbler, right, all those different masterwork, different professions we talked about last week. If you were making a musket, the parts for that musket were each made by one person, like all by the same person, each made in sequence, and each custom made for that specific musket. And it wasn't until the 1700s, late 1700s, when folks started figuring out, shoot, if we speed up this process by unsophisticating, taking some of the master level, like close-in detail, fine work out of it and standardizing stuff, we can make a lot of not quite as good stuff in terms of individual parts, but much more efficiently. And if we make them just precise enough that they're interchangeable, then I can have one person really good at making triggers, and one person who's really good at making the matchlock or flintlock or other sparking or ignition mechanism in that firearm, and so forth. And so we get one person making 100 or 1,000 triggers a day, and all of a sudden we get a couple of people together in this factory, and now we're making thousands of firearms a week instead of one firearm every 6 weeks, something like that, right? Taking it from bar stock, hammer forging a barrel and so forth, and all of the inner mechanisms of it. Yeah, you can just make a whole bunch, and then when the thing inevitably breaks, because we don't know a lot about metallurgy, we're using iron, we're starting to figure out stuff like steel. Eventually we'll have entirely new metals available like aluminum in the late 1800s and so forth. And this has continued forward and accelerated, and now we have cheap plastic crap available from everywhere, from places like Temu and AliExpress, right? So these three things, these three major changes in how we do life and living and so forth, are all happening around the same time in the 1700s. Huge amounts of change when you think about it, and an extremely rapid pace of change relative to all of human history before that. Okay? Huge, huge, huge big deal. So these three things together combine to cause the so-called rise of secularism, which is an emphasis on a lifestyle that isn't built around being a member of a local church, which is everybody in Europe for the past couple thousand years. All right. We also have, in the 1700s, as a function of there's a new degree of surplus wealth, and in the continent we now have a legit middle class for the first time. So the merchant class. This leads to a slight democratization of what used to be the priestly class, the ruling class, the elite class expression of dominance over the land, gardens, and parks. Back in Mesopotamia, right, it took an army of slaves or enslaved people to haul up the water for those hanging gardens of Babylon and so on and so forth. Now, with the Industrial Revolution, the rise of the merchant class, and so on and so forth, now kind of anybody can have a front lawn and put in a little garden patch. And not just a garden patch to grow potatoes and carrots and subsistence foods, but also let's plant some pretty flowers just for the sake of it. And then over time, some of these gardens, well, let's combine them into a little neighborhood park. And it's not a neighborhood park that the king or queen sort of reached down into our dirty little lives and, blessed us with the ability to have this park. It's like, no, we got this together and we can all enjoy this as local neighborhood people. All right? So, if you go out West Sunset Drive when you're trick-or-treating on Thursday, I think Thursday is Halloween, is that right? Okay. And you walk by my house, like 100 yards past that is a dog park. And you don't have to be royalty to go use the dog park by my house. That is rooted in this, okay? So as the United States is just starting to become a thing, we have our model for culture, the UK, right? A lot of our culture was sort of copy-pasted from them back in the day, just like the Romans did from the Greeks. There's this sense of, okay, so those British folks are doing parks and gardens. Well, we got a lot more land than they do. Like, the entire British Isles landmass is a fraction of even just New England in terms of land area. Let's have some parks. And so right as democracy is starting as this huge grand experiment, we have these little neighborhood parks in the form of town squares and town gardens and town green spaces right downtown where the action is. And this, crucially, is where Americans go in places like Boston and have debates about democracy, having meaningful conversations in an era before we're all sort of glued to our cell phones and laptops. How do we want to do this? Like, what does it mean to be a citizen of the United States of America? Now, citizen at that point was pretty narrowly defined, right? You're male, you're white. In some places you had to be a landowner. In some other places you had to be a Christian, right? So fairly narrow construction, but it's not going to be like that forever. Question, comment, verbal abuse.
Comment is that they also went to like the ale houses and coffee houses, and it's also theories that half of the reason why those places were like banned or like seemed as like less reputable because people went there to talk about those things.
Yeah. So this is a process that we call pejoration, or ascribing negative values to because it scares us. If we are the ruling class and people are going to coffee shops and saying things like, yeah, well, like, that's just your opinion, man, and they're getting these troublesome ideas like democracy and the vote and all of this, then, yeah, that gets pejorated in elite societies. But the pejoration doesn't stick in America because we stuck it to the man and pushed the British out. So this is pretty cool stuff. This is really pretty cool stuff, right? So people planting flower gardens helps in the UK. The place that we kicked out, they gave us the idea for how to create public spaces to gather and be. So, can any of you think of a place in Carbondale where we have specifically this? They're called First Amendment areas. Are any of you aware of the First Amendment sites on campus or in downtown Carbondale, where you can go and say your opinions and not be afraid of getting thrown in the Bastille in France or the Tower of London over in the UK? Anybody know where those places are?
I see a lot of stuff going on outside of Morris Library.
Yes, exactly. That's one of them, right? There's another one in front of Fainer Hall. And in Carbondale, one of the big First Amendment free speech like designated zones is, you ever been on 13 right at the railroad tracks, kind of right by, Thai Taste? Yeah, and there's that railroad station pavilion thing. These days, a lot of people are protesting about, Palestine and Israel and all that stuff. right? That happened because of this. We have specifically places where you can go and say your piece and not, excuse me, not worry about getting thrown in jail for it because of this. That's amazing. So it's important that we know about those things. And you don't have to agree with anybody else that's saying anything else in those places, but we all have that First Amendment right now enshrined in our culture and our commissioning legislation. All right, so in the 1700s up until the American Revolution, right, so early 1700s, that Industrial Revolution is having to be fueled now by also the increasingly accelerated resource extraction of timber. So, any of you guys talk about the history of logging in America in any of your classes? A little bit?
A little.
Okay.
In policy, we touch on it.
Yeah, right on. So what do you know about, excuse me, the first 2/3 of the 1700s? I apologize, I'm like dying over here. It's just a sinus infection. I'm not contagious. Tested for COVID. I'm good to go. Anybody know what the history of forestry and land use was in the eastern half of the United States in the first half of the 1700s?
Like broken arrow policy?
Second?
Like broken arrow policy?
Broken arrow policy, and at this point we're still colonies, and the southeastern massive chunk or lobe of the forest has these things called live oaks. And if you think about how a live oak grows with these long spreading branches, in some cases over 100-foot lateral spread and so forth, well, those make really good timbers and spars and masts and so forth for the British Empire, for warships. And so Britain is absolutely plundering coastal Georgia. And in the early 1700s, I guess, Florida is going to be managed and run by Spain until it gets annexed as a colony. But those live oaks were getting chopped down and essentially sailed across the world to be self-propelled British cannon for all of the colonies. And this is the era in which the saying, "the sun never sets on the British Empire," this is where that gets set up, and American timber is how. So, the vast resource available is now getting matched, and in some cases overmatched, by the very new industrial strength and soon to be steam powered and later to be dynamite powered in the case of coastal redwoods and giant sequoia, because we can't make saws big enough to cut those down, so we're gonna explode them down, and so on and so forth, right? So our resource extraction is now going gangbusters, full speed ahead. And then in 1782, the United States Constitution is signed, and that wood gathering doesn't go to British ships anymore. Now it's going to the American Navy, and fairly soon, the Confederate Navy, and the Union Navy, and man, it's chaos. Okay? Cool. Let's actually stop a couple of minutes early there, because I am dying, and we'll pick it up with the early 1800s. So just as George Washington and Alexander Hamilton and all these other guys are just finishing up in the late 1700s, in the first couple of years of the 1800s, we're going to talk about the next phase after the pure colonial phase, the acquisition and disposal phase of American land management, forest management, and so forth. And we'll pick it up there. I'm around for questions if you have them. If you are here to do some resume stuff, a couple of us are going to be meeting here at 11 at the table outside my office. If you are not meeting with me, think about it, because holy cow, I don't know if you know this, but usajobs.gov and all of the state hiring websites and stuff like that, it's starting to, as the youth used to say, get crack-a-lackin'. Very exciting time. Bureau of Land Management, Forest Service, kind of if you're doing fire, Park Service, United States Army Corps of Engineers, all of these different mosaic organizations we spent all that time talking about, they are now starting to hire, including with student hiring authorities specifically, with posts that are only up for a couple of days at a time, and then they're gone. Matthew, the other day we saw Washington and Oregon. It was like 9 or 10 people getting hired
Yeah.
as students. Yeah, for recreation ranger stuff. So it is time. It is time. I'm around for questions if you have them. Otherwise, we'll see you on Thursday. Happy Halloween. Be safe. Don't do anything I wouldn't do.